So how did you get involved in space and the whole space thing? How did it pull you in?
I got involved in a very unusual way. I think probably different than most people. This wasn't a subject I thought I would ever really dive into this. But I had started a site around the end of 2016 called weirdhistorian.com. I love writing about weird history. I've written, all my books have the same theme of something odd and bizarre. And so for the site, I had a bunch of stuff already written to get it going. And then I was looking for some new stories. And I remembered reading somewhere about Nikola Tesla being in contact with Mars or trying to contact Mars. And I thought, well, let me look up some articles about that, going through like old newspaper archives to find some original sources, and let me see what I can find. Maybe that's a fun thing to type up. So I went into I think Google newspaper archive and started searching for stories about that. And instead, I found a story about actually a man from London whose name was Hugh Mansfield Robinson, and he was a London lawyer, and he was in telepathic communication with a Martian woman named Umaruru, and this was 1926. And and so I found this one article, and it had this really wild headline about big-eared Martian and telepaths. Just, what was this? So I read this article, I'm like, wow, this is something I've never heard of. And so I started looking at more about that. Like I just pivoted my idea there from Tesla to this guy. And I started finding more and more articles about him. And this was like global. This was like New York Times writing about this guy. It wasn't just like a small paper picking up a story. I got in touch with the British Telecommunications Archives, and they sent me this massive like 250-page PDF of files about the case. All the original memos that went through the London Post Office, which was running the Rugby radio tower, which was the tallest and most powerful radio tower in the world at that point. And so Mars was in opposition that year, 1926, so I think about 35 billion miles away at that point. So he was trying to send a telegraph to Mars as opposed to just telepathic. Let's get something more scientific. So the Rugby was like, yeah, the post office was like, sure, we'll send the telegraph off to Mars. And they charged them their long distance rate, which I thought was pretty funny. Like for them, it was like, and they actually note this in their memos because they have memos like to each other. Like, oh, we got this request in, and the man seems to be serious about his request. And they said basically it was like good publicity for them because the media picked up on the fact that was the rate. So the rate got plastered all over the media for long distance. So it was like per word, not per mile, by the way, just to clarify that. So it wasn't outrageously expensive or anything. So he sends this off. This was, I think, October 1926, and he does not get a response, which might not surprise you.
Sure.
But he was informed by Umaruru telepathically that they were waiting for the signal and that the scientists were laughing because I guess we could not receive their signal. Our scientists were not smart enough to receive their signal. So he was angry about this, basically blaming Earth's scientists, not the supposed Martians. So it didn't work. So anyway, 2 years later, Mars is in opposition again, and he tries one more time with Rugby, and again it fails. So this whole thing to me was just really remarkable. And the more I looked into this story, the more I started seeing what else was going on in the periphery around this era, going back to the early 1900s, the late 1800s, of course, getting into Percival Lowell and Schiaparelli with Martian canals, and how that sort of, Schiaparelli called them canali, which was channels, but got misinterpreted to canals, which then conjures up the idea of artificial creation and who's creating them, these giant Martians that are able to dig canals all across the planet, which is remarkable given the fact that we had just taken 10 years to complete the Suez Canal. So imagine taking that big feat for one small canal, and these guys are doing it across the whole planet. So they thought, oh, they must be far more advanced and much more powerful than us. So all these things just unfolded before me. And then, of course, I found the Tesla story. I was looking for, then I'm finding Marconi's getting Martian signals, heads of Harvard trying to arrange plans of how we might want to communicate or send signals to Mars. And so I just became completely fascinated. And maybe that's a long way of telling you my way in.
And that's resulted in the big book.
Yeah. So what happened was I pitched a book called The Book of Martians, and it was going to be just a book of Martians through pop culture, through early scientific belief, that sort of thing. And my publisher, Quirk Books, said, let's do the big book of Mars, and let's make it about the whole planet and treat it like a pop culture star. And so I thought, oh, that actually sounds great. I'm excited. And that took me down a path that I really didn't expect to go down. Then I found myself talking to like amazing people at NASA JPL. I took a tour of JPL, talked to people all within the scientific community, like people like Steve Squires, who led the Mars Spirit and Opportunity rover missions, Dr. Gil Levin, who led the experiment, the labeled release experiment on the Mars Viking landers in the mid-70s, and believed he found his results for the life detection test were positive on both landers. And to this day, no one's completely explained that data or refuted it. So that exists, which is amazing that his results came back positive, that there is life on Mars. So who knows what we may find yet in terms of microorganisms. But yeah, I found myself fully invested in Mars and learning a lot and being able to take what I was learning and convey it in terms that were friendly to a mass audience, which I think when talking to a lot of these scientists, I think they were excited to be able to share stories with me, being able to write them for the masses. They said, hey, we can write to each other, we can speak to each other in our scientific papers, but that doesn't get beyond that community. So I was thrilled to share their amazing stories with everybody because I'm amazed at what they do. I think it's wonderfully creative and just absolutely brilliant.
And how did you get involved with IBM for the project you did when you were at Ogilvy Mathers?
So when I worked at Ogilvy, IBM was the main client I was working on, and they've been at Ogilvy since the mid-90s, so it's a good relationship. That was a great account to work on. They do just amazing things in the world. I love what their technology has been enabling. So there were a couple cool things I got to do with them that aligned with my interest in space and Mars. One was they had, in 2019, they wanted to do a celebration for the 50th anniversary of the Apollo mission, which of course they had a fairly strong role in with the computer systems. So we created an experiential event in New York City at the Oculus, which is a public transit area, just a beautiful modern space. And we recreated a moon experience for people. We had a 30-foot digital screen and a 30-foot digital floor. So people could step onto it and it looked like the moon surface and it was interactive. So as you walked around, you left your boot prints on the moon. And then you saw yourself on this digital screen reflected as an astronaut on imagery of the moon around you. Basically, you could see the Eagle lander in the distance. And then as you moved around, danced, jumped, played, whatever, you'd see yourself reflected in your astronaut costume in 1/6 gravity. So it was really just a cool experience. People could come and learn about what IBM was doing. So that was great. And one of the other cool things that we were able to talk about there and in my book was a project they were doing called Cimon, which was an artificial intelligence robot put on the ISS for testing. And so this was going on. And so I said, hey, can I talk to the guy who's running this program, because the purpose of this Cimon robot, AI robot, was for long distance space travel to test how it could help astronauts in terms of having a companion. Could this help with loneliness? Could it understand human emotions? And could it even help resolve disputes maybe between astronauts? Like they were really looking at how AI could help beyond things like maybe with systems and those kinds of things also, which certainly could be helpful, but just how could it help humans maintain some sanity during a 6-month journey in a small place with Earth far away and eventually just becoming a dot in the distance and everything you've ever known that's existed is just gone, right, from your view. So how could this help? So it was great to have that access to that team and be able to speak with them.
The AI was called Cimon.
Cimon. I forgot offhand what that acronym stands for. It was funny because it's like spherical shaped. It's like a floating sphere with a flat face, but the face, they gave it like 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth. But it looks like, for as advanced as the technology is, the digital display of the face is something that looks like it's from the 1980s. It's just like a couple of pixels. It's a very rudimentary graphic for the face, but also charming in that way. Maybe less creepy.
Do you happen to know what happened to that technology? Is that now being deployed?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know exactly where it's gone recently. I haven't kept up with it in the past year or two since the book came out, but yeah, it'd be interesting to follow up. The plan was for long distance space travel, which we're still waiting for that to happen. So hopefully it was successful. There were some tests online where you could see the astronauts on the ISS interacting with it. It was actually rather humorous at points. I think at some points it got offended, which was funny. Or maybe a little bit angry. It was work in progress, but I think it was fairly successful.
Do you think you're going to go to space? Would you like to go into space?
I would, yeah. I'm excited about what's going on right now. Just watching what Blue Origin's doing, what SpaceX is doing. Hopefully NASA is able to do these missions that they're talking about. I know Artemis is in the works, but I'm hoping this just with some of these third-party private companies working on space tourism that in my lifetime I'll have a chance to go on some sort of journey, even if it's just up into space, just to see the Earth and come right back, that kind of thing. Or I would love to go to the moon. I think that would be just a phenomenal experience. If I can do it, I will.
But what about Mars? Would you go to Mars if
Commitment.
offered the opportunity?
I don't know. It's a terrible place. I have some quotes in my book. One of the scientists I interviewed, Dr. Jim Logan, he had so many great quotes about Mars, basically reminding me of how horrible it is there. Everyone kind of romanticizes it, especially like Elon Musk, right? Like, this is going to be amazing. We're going to build up a whole new world and colonize and all these things. And I get into all this in the book about the challenges of going to Mars as human beings. It's not friendly at all to us. I have a point in the book, actually. There's the 5 fastest ways you'll die on Mars. This was a list from Dr. Pascal Lee, who's a brilliant planetary scientist. And cancer radiation is the 5th. There's 4 other ways like that you'll just die immediately. It's really great. You'd have to be building underground to protect us from the radiation. It would probably be a pretty miserable existence. But one thing that I thought was really interesting that I talk about in the Big Book of Mars was an idea from Jim Logan, where he says that we should forget about Mars. The most valuable real estate in our solar system, he says, is Deimos, one of the 2 moons of Mars. And he says we should just core that out, and then you put space stations inside. He said you could fit maybe around 11 different space stations inside the core of Deimos. And then you create artificial gravity, and then you have complete protection from solar radiation through the surface of Deimos. And then he said if you want to go to Mars for like a weekend to the surface, maybe there's something there. You do that, but you don't stay there. And I thought that was interesting. That would also solve, if you had that space station with the gravity, then you could colonize, because then you have an Earth-like atmosphere. You create like an Earth-like environment with 1G. One thing I found really interesting that I don't feel like I see talked about too much is, with all the hoopla of colonization on Mars, we don't know if that's even possible. Forget about just getting there and building habitats that we can live in. We don't know if we can reproduce on Mars, because that's 1/3 gravity. Anything besides 1G is something that we haven't experienced in the human existence. Can reproduction even work? We don't know. And what's that? So I found that pretty fascinating.
There's sort of 3 stages. So arriving, and that's what lots of the technology and the conversation's about at the moment. Arriving, whether that's the moon, Mars. Then there's surviving, and then there's thriving. So on the longer term time horizon, and I don't know where the time horizons will be. Arriving maybe 10, 20 years. Surviving maybe 50 years. Thriving, maybe we're talking 100, 200, 300 years into the future before we need to figure out how to thrive in space. But we'll get there. 400 years going to come along in about 400 years time, and I expect humans to still be around, and they'll have figured some of this stuff out.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It seems like we're figuring these things out faster and faster. It is exciting to think about what's to come still. And it's funny, when I asked about how the idea of living inside of Deimos, that's on the surface, that sounds like a pretty wild idea. Let's go live inside the moon of Mars. So I said, how long would it take for that to happen? And his response was about 20 years after people stopped laughing about it. And I thought that was a really good response, because then he gave the example. He said, think about like the idea of flight to begin with. That was laughable, right? Like any time before the late 1800s, people would have scoffed at that idea. But then when they stopped thinking it was silly and put some science, some math and physics to it, they figured out flight. And then shortly after, it was, what are we talking, like 30 years, less than 30 years after the Wright brothers, you have Lindbergh crossing the Atlantic, and then 30 some years after that, we're on the moon. So we do have these capabilities when we put our minds to it and we put science to what we want to do, we can achieve it. So yeah, you're right, it'll happen.
Yeah, my children who are in their early 20s at the moment, I expect them to live to 120 years old, that sort of range. And my grandchildren haven't been born yet, but maybe 150, 200 years old. So when you think about it as your close family relationship, but you extend it to those sorts of time horizons, you think, yeah, this is touchable. This is only a couple of generations away.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I'm sure. There's a lot of hope that we'll have at least someone on Mars by the 2030s. So again, exciting.
Yeah,
what an achievement
really
that would
exciting.
be.
So what are the big projects that you're working on at the moment, Mark?
I have a new book I'm finishing right now, probably turning it in this month, maybe within days actually. And this one is on the UFO phenomenon, which has been really fascinating. It covers off on the phenomenon spanning the human experience, going up to everything that's been going on today. So it goes through, obviously, a lot of the era from the late 40s onward, and just touches on a lot of different amazing cases and gives evidence or gives stories that present what happened and why people are convinced these experiences were real. And then, of course, explanations for how maybe they were some sort of natural phenomena or something else. And I don't have an agenda. I'm not taking a side one way or the other. I'm just presenting a lot of, to me, very fascinating stories, very curious stories. And the reader can decide which they want to believe. But what is really especially compelling is what's been happening lately, especially with what the Navy pilots are seeing, that the U.S. government has basically said we don't know what these are. There are things flying in our space that we have not identified. And that's pretty remarkable and amazing admission. And so I have all these stories, but I also have a whole section on science and scientific efforts to discover extraterrestrial life. So not necessarily traditional UFOs, as you might think of them as saucers, but more like SETI efforts, how that all began. Early beliefs from early scientists going back to the late 1600s, and belief in life on the moon and belief on life on every planet in the solar system. These were just early scientific thoughts of what people actually believed at the time. So I go through that. I get into some of the early Mars beliefs, which I touched on more heavily in the Big Book of Mars, but did a lighter version here. And then it gets up to what Avi Loeb is doing with the Galileo project and trying to collect data for interstellar objects like Oumuamua going through the solar system and trying to detect the next one so we can actually get a camera up to it and get photos and get more evidence of what these things are. And looking at data for what's happening closer to Earth with what the Navy pilots are seeing, and collecting his own data with a team of, I think, more than 100 scientists working on this who are truly curious now. And the stigma has really gone away, allowing them to speak openly about this and be curious about it and put time into it. So I find that exciting. And then I've talked with other scientists as well about their work on searching for technosignatures on exoplanets and how that might lead to some evidence of life on another planet, obviously many light years away. But that starts with things like we just got the first images from James Webb, helping see what's in the atmospheres of these exoplanets, and if that gives us clues as to the potential for life on those planets. So it's all exciting stuff, and I can't wait to see what we find out in the next few years. I think it's going to be just remarkable what comes out more and more.
Have you got a name for it yet?
Yeah, the new book will be called Greetings, Earthlings.
Fantastic.
Yeah, yeah. And it'll have lots of imagery in it as well. It'll be similar in style to the Big Book of Mars, fully illustrated. Just a lot of amazing stories, some of which people might be somewhat familiar with, and some that are hopefully a bit more obscure and unusual, and maybe some different theories people haven't heard before. Lots of interviews with people across various fields, from NASA, various members of the scientific community, to ufologists, people who've had experiences. So it's a wide range.
Now, I know that you said you don't declare in the book any particular agenda and that, but do you have a sneaking suspicion personally that you're prepared to declare about whether you think, we have been visited or not?
It's so hard to say. Something is happening, and it's funny because I have the two sides, like the voices on two sides of my brain. I have the people people I know who've had experiences that were like right in front of them, basically, not like really distant and with other people. And then there's mass sightings like the Phoenix Lights in 1997, where like 20,000 people are seeing something. So it's very mysterious. Like, what are they seeing? There's no great explanation, but maybe there still could be something terrestrial that we just don't know about. There's always the possibility there's some secret technology we don't know about. So there's certainly, I always look at Occam's razor, like the simplest explanation is most likely the correct one. So it's hard to always just jump to aliens as being the explanation. Also, one of the people I talked to was Jill Tarter, a brilliant scientist who really got SETI going. And she said regarding what's been going on that we just don't know all of physics yet. And there's just still things we're learning. And she talked about like elves and sprites or lightning that goes up from clouds. And we didn't know about that till we could see above clouds. And then she said reports from pilots stopped about those kinds of things because they didn't know what it was that they were seeing. So they saw something unusual and reported it. And then the other voice, again, spoke with Pascal Lee, who is very intrigued by what's going on, but also says, hey, we can't jump to conclusions because we all want answers. That's human nature, right? Like we want answers. And when we don't have them, we find them on our own. Is that science takes time and we have to wait and we have to have more data. We don't have enough data from the videos that we've seen. They're very short. So it takes patience and time and ultimately we probably find an answer. And if that answer is extraterrestrial, I think that's pretty exciting. So yeah, I'm giving you probably a not very direct answer. I apologize, but I'm very intrigued. I think there's something going on. I don't know if I'm 100% convinced that we've been visited by aliens, but I do think something unusual is happening. So yeah.
There's something going on, but we can't prove it one way or another yet.
Yeah. But it's not nothing.
Yeah. Hey, Mark, it's been great chatting with you. I really appreciate your time to come on and have a little chat about things. Hopefully we'll meet up again, maybe in person at one of the conferences or something, but love to keep in contact with you and get you on the show again at some point.
Yeah, that'd be terrific. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.